that they, at a very visceral ground level, convert the war for the old Union into something very different, into a war for equality, for racial equality, for a new notion of citizenship, and it's very threatening. It's very threatening to much of the social order. Many of these African American soldiers, they're not sent off to some far off battlefield. They're often serving as patrol over towns like Danville and Lebanon, Kentucky, or over Lexington or Louisville, and much of the population who has very recently held these folks in slavery is deeply resentful of this. They feel betrayed. They feel that Lincoln has betrayed them. A very interesting figure who really exemplifies this is a man named Frank Wolford, who was a colonel from Lincoln County, Kentucky, sort of south central Kentucky. He was a very, very decorated Kentucky Unionist. He had actually fought in East Tennessee. He was actually in Maryville for a while fighting against Joe Wheeler. But he was vehemently opposed to emancipation as a war aim, and had famously said that Kentucky was like Jesus being crucified between two thieves, Lincoln on one side and Jefferson Davis on the other. He had declared Lincoln to be, he declared him to be a traitor because he had violated he had turned a war for union into a war of emancipation. And many of these folks became what I term belated Confederates. It was too late for them to actually switch sides. But in sort of a cultural way, and in terms of their own memory, they developed a kind of a shame at having served in a Union cause that somehow the rug had been pulled out under them. And when we talk about that era, we don't usually talk about those folks. We talk about it as this kind of triumphal, we're all accepting the fact that emancipation and equal rights is coming out of this war. But actually, there are a lot of people who were deeply opposed to a lot of that and went the other direction. This was true in Kentucky, and it was true in Missouri as well. But Missouri had some other complications to this. Missouri had a very large German population. The German population in Missouri was much more anti-slavery as a general rule and much more pro-union as a general rule than many of the others. The most staunchly pro-Southern, pro-Confederate part of Missouri was not in southern Missouri, as you might think, but was actually in central Missouri, an area that was called Little Dixie. Later on was called Little Dixie. In fact, southern Missouri is the Ozarks. And if you look in the census of the Ozarks in the 1860s, you'll find a lot of people who moved there from Sevier County, Tennessee, or moved there from Greene County, Tennessee, or Blount County. A lot of people from here in the mountains of East Tennessee moved to the mountains of the Ozarks. I mean, the culture developed in a very similar fashion. And those folks, just like here, tend to be more pro-union. Just same thing with Northwest Arkansas. So you had this pro-Confederate population that was trapped, surrounded on all sides by Unionists. And we all know what a cornered animal is going to do. It's going to get pretty vicious. And this is the world that created Jesse James. This is the world that created William Clark Quantrill, and the world that created Bloody Bill Anderson. And so the Missouri story became this very, very violent guerrilla struggle very early on. Eventually, Kentucky would descend into that, and certainly East Tennessee would descend into that as well. But you add to this story of emancipation in the midst of it too, and that adds another complicating factor. So many of these folks who are caught there are finding their whole world is just falling apart around them. And so in the book I talk about what happens after the war, and the problem of Reconstruction, of how do you move from war to peace when the war isn't really over. The war doesn't really end in April of 1865 there. Jesse James, there's a recent series on PBS. He's still very much an intriguing figure. He was carrying on much of his exploits in the years after the war. And Missouri came under a local radical Republican rule, much like Tennessee did. Kentucky, on the other hand, immediately went to very conservative Democratic rule. And but yet, under the surface, those two states, just like Tennessee, were not subject to the federal Reconstruction policy. It was the nature of the complications of it that Reconstruction, in terms of meaning transitioning from a slave system to a free system, had to happen on their own. The Freedmen's Bureau would show up, but they didn't have the same power that they did in, say, Alabama or Mississippi. The U.S. Army was much less of a presence there because these were loyal states. And this was part of the weird irony of being caught in the middle here, between you were loyal, so you're not supposed to be punished for the Confederates, for the Civil War, but yet you're experiencing the same kinds of gut-wrenching social change that the people in the lower South are doing. And so you get a lot of violence, a lot of racial violence. Even before the Ku Klux Klan emerges, you have groups called regulators that commit all kinds of acts of racial violence across, particularly central Kentucky. Lynchings and mob attacks. Much of the African American population simply leaves. They go to Lexington or Louisville, or they go to Cincinnati, or to St. Louis or Kansas City, which is a brand new sort of up and coming city at the time. It's a story that is not discussed very much because it complicates in some very fundamental ways our general understanding of the Civil War. We tend to see, again, the Civil War as these, a big industrial society in the North and a plantation society in the South, and they clash, and then the plantation society is essentially defeated, and then we all move on as before. But it's a much more complicated story. And for whites and blacks, they have to sort of fashion their own new understanding of politics, their own new understanding of what citizenship means, what equality means. How they're going to remember this conflict. And, in some ways, they still wrestle with it to this day. There's an old saying that Kentucky waited until after the war to secede. A lot of people are surprised. You mentioned that people are surprised. Bill, you mentioned that people are surprised that East Tennessee was Unionist. People are surprised to hear Kentucky was Unionist. And Missouri, on the other hand, many people fail to realize how Southern it was, because it became so Midwestern in the decades after the war, as places like St. Louis and Kansas City grew, as the German population continued to grow in the state, which was always much more of a northerly cultural orientation. And so, but Missouri is still very much, I always compare it to a tornado. You have all these different forces, north, south, east, and west, and instead of them all peacefully commingling, they kind of enter a vortex of craziness. So that's Missouri. The book starts in 1860, and I go into quite a bit about how people thought about the Union, what they thought about the political system, and race and citizenship. And then I take it through the war and then into the post-war period. I finish in 1872, which is the first presidential election after the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, which gave African Americans the right to vote. And there's a lot of sort of surprises and twists and turns in there. When I started working on this as a dissertation at Northwestern University, there were very few people who were writing about these states at all. Since that time, there have been others who have gotten into it and have started to explore not only Kentucky, Missouri, but also East Tennessee, and have started to unpack a lot of these kind of complicated relationships really at the heart of the country. And I think that here we are on the 150th anniversary of the war, and one of the nice things is that I think we can appreciate just how difficult and how complicated this time was. We want to honor and revere and celebrate the service of those who lived during that time, and remember both civilians and soldiers. But we need to remember that they didn't know how it all ended up. They didn't know how the story would end, and they weren't reading history books 150 years later of their own time. They were experiencing it day to day, not knowing who would win, and more importantly, not knowing what victory would mean, or for that matter, what defeat would mean. And I think here we are 150 years later. I think we have enough distance to it that we can explore things like Unionists in Sevier County, what that would have meant, or blacks and whites, Confederate and Unionists in the border states. And so I would hope that what I've done here contributes to that new story. So, that's all I have. I was just coming to the end anyway. I appreciate it, but
I want them to get time to buy your book.
yes, thank you. I appreciate it.
And Bella's book.
I've already bought one.
The book is